My mother handed me a black trash bag with 3 shirts stuffed inside and said, "This is more than you deserve." I was 14 years old, standing on the porch of a house I grew up in, and my own father wouldn't even look at me. 16 years later, that same man stood in my office lobby, shaking, holding a folder full of unpaid bills, asking a receptionist if his daughter would see him. She checked her screen. She said, "I'm sorry, sir. She's not taking meetings today." She didn't know it was me who gave that instruction 3 years earlier. Because I knew this day would come, let me back up. Because you need to understand what kind of house I grew up in before you understand what kind of woman walked out of it. My name doesn't matter for this story. So let's just say I'm Dana. I grew up in a modest split-level house in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of neighborhood where everyone waved but nobody actually knew each other. On paper, we looked fine. My father worked in insurance. My mother stayed home and ran the house like a military operation. And I had a younger brother, Caleb, who was, by every measure our parents used, the golden child. I was not the golden child. I was the reminder of a version of my mother she didn't like, too loud, too stubborn, too much like the father she'd cut out of her own life years before. I didn't know that as a kid. I just knew that no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. And no matter what Caleb did, it was celebrated. The conflict didn't happen overnight. It built for years, the way a crack builds in a foundation, quiet, then suddenly the whole wall gives. The night everything broke, I was 14. My father had just lost a client at work. A bad month turned into a bad quarter, and the tension in that house had been thick for weeks. I made one mistake. I forgot to pick up my brother from soccer practice because I lost track of time at the library working on a school project I actually cared about. Caleb waited 40 minutes. He was fine. He was annoyed, but fine. My mother did not see it that way. When I walked in the door that night, she was standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed. And I knew before she said a word that something had shifted. She told me I was selfish. That I only thought about myself. That I had always been a burden since the day I was born. Wrong, her words, not an exaggeration. Born wrong, my father stood behind her, silent, the way he always was when she got like this. Because silence was easier than defending me. I went to bed that night thinking it would blow over like it always did. It didn't. 3 days later, I came home from school and my clothes were already packed. Not folded in suitcases like a normal family transition. Shoved into a black trash bag, the kind you use for yard waste. My mother stood at the door and told me I was old enough to figure things out. She said I could go stay with my aunt in Dayton, who hadn't even been told I was coming until 40 minutes before I showed up on her doorstep. Confused and shaking, holding that bag like it was the only proof I still existed. My aunt, Rosalind, was not a warm woman by nature. She was practical, tired, working 2 jobs, raising a teenager of her own. But she let me in. She didn't ask a lot of questions that first night. She just said, "You'll sleep on the pull-out. We'll figure the rest out tomorrow." And somehow, that plain and glamorous kindness meant more to me than anything my own parents had said to me in years. I want to be honest with you about something. Because this isn't a story about a perfect, angelic teenager wronged by monsters. I was angry. I skipped school for a while. I said things to my aunt I regret. I tested every boundary because some part of me wanted someone Enage to prove they'd give up on me too, just so I could stop being surprised when people did. Rosalind never gave up. She sat me down one night, maybe 4 months in, and said something I've never forgotten. You can spend your whole life proving them right, or you can spend it proving yourself worth something. Only one of those actually belongs to you. That sentence rewired something in me. I started showing up. Not because I suddenly trusted the world again, but because I realized my anger was theirs, built by them, and I was the one carrying it around like it was mine. I finished high school 2 years later with decent grades, not spectacular, but enough. I worked part-time at a hardware store, saved every dollar. and got into a state school on a partial scholarship plus loans I'd spent a decade paying off. During those college years, my parents reached out exactly twice. Once when I turned 18, a text from my mother that said, "Happy birthday. Hope you're doing okay." No apology. No explanation. Just enough to keep a door cracked open on her terms, not mine. The second time was when Caleb graduated high school, an invitation to the party that felt less like an invitation and more like an obligation they assumed I'd fulfill. I didn't go. I built my life in pieces, slowly. I studied business and marketing, not because I had some grand plan for revenge. I want to be clear about that. Because revenge was never actually the plan, but because I was good at understanding what made people and companies grow. And it gave me something structured to hold onto when everything else in my life had felt so unstable that my first real job was unglamorous. A marketing coordinator role at a mid-sized logistics company. I worked harder than anyone needed to, not to prove anything to my parents, but because Rosalind's voice was still in my head. Prove yourself worth something. Within 4 years, I was running a department. Within 8, I'd left to start my own consulting firm, helping small companies fix broken brand strategy. It wasn't overnight success. There were 2 years where I barely paid myself, where I ate ramen in a one-bedroom apartment and wondered if I'd made a mistake leaving stability behind. But I kept going because going back felt like admitting the trash bag had been right about me. By year 12 after I left that house, my firm had contracts with companies across 3 states. By year 14, I'd bought the house Rosalind used to rent and given it to her outright, paid off, because she was the only person who showed up for me when it cost her something to do it. I never once called my parents to tell them any of this. I didn't need them to know. That's an important distinction, because what happened next wasn't about making sure they saw my success. It was about what happened when they came looking for it themselves. 16 years after that night with the trash bag, my father's insurance company went through layoffs. He was 58, hard to place at that age in that industry, and the family finances that had always seemed so stable to outsiders turned out to be built on debt nobody talked about. My mother's health had started declining too, medical bills stacking up. Caleb, it turned out, had moved across the country years earlier and wasn't in a position to help even if he'd wanted to. Someone, I still don't know who, told my father about my company. Maybe a mutual contact. Maybe he'd just been searching my name every so often, waiting. He showed up at my office unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon. I wasn't in the lobby when it happened, but my assistant told me later, word for word. He asked for me by name. He said he was my father. My assistant, who had strict standing instructions I'd put in place years earlier, not out of spite, but out of self-protection, told him I wasn't taking unscheduled meetings, and that if he wanted to leave contact information, she'd pass it along. He left a folder. Inside were bills, a handwritten note. Not really an apology, more of an explanation, the kind that circles around the word sorry without ever landing on it. It talked about stress, about how hard those years had been for them too, about how they'd always assumed I'd land on my feet, because I was the strong one I sat with. That folder for 3 days before I responded, here's the truth about revenge. That nobody tells you in advance. I thought about it. I thought about letting the silence sit there permanently, about letting him wonder forever if I even opened that folder. Some wounded, 14-year-old part of me wanted that. I won't pretend otherwise, but I thought about Rosalind, about that pull-out couch, about the sentence that changed my life. And I realized that if I let my worth be defined by punishing them, I was still living in that kitchen, still being handed that trash bag, just wearing a nicer coat while I did it. So I called my father. Not my mother, not yet, my father, because he was the one who'd shown up. I didn't yell. I didn't recount every wound out loud, because he already knew them. And reciting them wouldn't have healed anything. It would have just given him a performance of pain to react to instead of the real thing sitting quietly between us. I told him I would pay off enough of the medical debt to get my mother stable care. And I told him exactly why. not because he'd earned it, and not because I owed him anything, but because I refused to become someone who let another person suffer just to balance a scale. I told him this was the last time, that I wasn't rebuilding a relationship, I was closing an account. He cried on the phone. I didn't. I'd cried enough for both of us over 16 years. I paid it. Quietly, through a lawyer, no dramatic scene, no photo, no announcement. My mother never called to thank me. Some part of me expected that. Old patterns don't dissolve just because circumstances change. But something in me settled that year, in a way it never had before. Not because I'd gotten justice in some cinematic sense, but because I finally understood that the healthiest revenge isn't cruelty. It's becoming someone your past could never have predicted, and then choosing, on your own terms, whether to let the people who hurt you witness it. If you're watching this and someone made you feel like a trash bag full of leftover expectations instead of a person, hear me clearly. Their failure to see your worth was never proof that it didn't exist. It just meant they weren't the ones who got to define it. Go find your Rosalind, whoever that is for you, and let them help you build the version of yourself nobody saw coming. If this story moved you, stay a while. I share stories like this every week, real, raw journeys of betrayal, resilience, and the quiet kind of revenge that looks like building a life so good it speaks for itself. Subscribe, and let's keep telling these stories together.